So it's a pleasure to introduce to you Ulrich Gumbrecht, of whom I've already spoken a bit in the introduction to the symposium itself. Even if it is a difficult task to introduce Professor Gumbrecht, because he has published so widely, and when I was drawing up the remarks for today, I almost wrote he has published so wildly. But the autocorrect caught me. He's published, and I mean published wildly in the sense of the roaming and untamable intellect, and of a really stunning intellectual range. Just to give you a sense of things, he's had over 1,000 publications, translated into more than 20 languages, including a history of Spanish literature, monographs on medieval narrative, on rhetoric in the French Revolution, on Zola, on the idea of presence, on philology, and especially important for today, on the aesthetics of sports. Gumbrecht is, on the one hand, the prototypical old-school European academic, trained as a Romanist. He masters many modern and ancient languages, especially German, English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And I don't think I know of many other foreigners, and you'll excuse the embarrassment of the comparison, except for people like Nabokov and some other notable exceptions, who have developed such a beautiful, naturally idiosyncratic English writing style. It's really remarkable. And he masters not only these many languages, but also their literary traditions, and he covers virtually every historical epoch from the Middle Ages onward. To give you a sense of this, he became a full professor in Germany at the unheard of age of 26, a mere child, for professorships, eventually gaining a professorship at the Collège de France, and then moving to Stanford, where he is now the Albert Gerhard Professor of Literature. But unlike the great Romanists of the past, Gumbrecht is also a powerful contemporary cultural critic, polemicizing regularly on German television and radio and newspapers about anti-Americanism, the bankruptcy of academia, the National Socialist past, and most recently about the European immigration crisis. His thrilling description of what it means to be a sports fan in his book In Praise of Athletic Beauty rendered him probably the only person, at least the only person I know of, who has had his books blurbed by Stephen Greenblatt and Sports Illustrated. And I know you're most proud of the Sports Illustrated blurb. Yeah. It would take far too much time to list the titles of his books and his contributions to the history of ideas, including his fascinating studies on presence and on cultural mood, or Stimmung. But for a glimpse into his originality and impact, consider what is probably his most eccentric book, yet one of my favorites, and it's called In 1926, Living at the Edge of Time. It's a dazzling presentation of 51 cross-referenced entries, from bullfighting to airplanes to dance crazes, that encourage a non-narrative reading style. We flip back and forth from entry to entry, they're cross-referenced, garnering not a singular story about the year 1926, but rather a thick and elegantly interwoven description. This new form of cultural history does not pretend to recover a real history, but rather it transports us back to history's unaccessible messiness, to its promiscuous mishmash of events. The book represents just one of Gumbrecht's many ways of shifting the paradigms of cultural and intellectual history. So his astounding scope came home to me really personally when I organized the conference, and all of the people who contacted me and wanted to know what time his talk was. Romanists, comparatists, Germanists, medievalists, aesthetic theorists, media theorists, and sports historians, everyone considers Professor Gumbrecht to be one of their own. And the same goes for us today as students of sports who know his existing book on athletic beauty and, like me, look forward to today's lecture, which, he tells me, is a follow-up to his first book, or a kind of sequel, perhaps, of sorts, and it's entitled, What Do Sports Spectators Invest? Now, as our Dean David Cameron already pointed out, or as I mentioned before, among the other things that Sepp will talk about in the lecture are why people root for losing teams, which makes us think of our Maple Leafs and also reminds me of my childhood as a fan of the perennial last placers, the Cleveland Indians. I'm especially eager to hear the answer here. So I'm pleased to present to you Hans-Ulrich Sepp Gumbrecht.
Thank you so much. There are some introductions that you find really boring, especially in the age of Wikipedia. And I mean, my wife is always saying that modesty is not my main problem, but even with that, there are some introductions that are so beautiful that they embarrass you. But thanks for this embarrassment, John, and thanks for inviting me. And I was happy to see Marcus for the first time in the email age. You know, there are people whom you imagine what might they look like. And then at some point you lose that question. They become sheer email presences, but caring about presence, I'm very happy that now I have a face. And I want to thank once again to Marlo Berg for the organization. Not only has it been logistically perfect, everybody is here, everything worked out, but I told her, and I bet many of you share this feeling with me, normally when you get correspondence, email correspondence about a colloquium, it's bad news because you're always behind, and you feel tempted to delete that. But when I saw Marlo, and thank goodness this is not a very frequent first name, I think my face was lighting up. That was nice to get email about a colloquium. I wanted to thank you for that again. So not only for the logistics, but for the tone. I'm sitting here, I mean, I hope it is not only a question of old age, but this is about the ambiguity of keynote. I mean, keynote addresses are good for you if you're at the beginning of your academic career, then you can line up keynotes, and the more keynotes you have accumulated, the better for you. Somehow there must be a point coverage somewhere in the dean's office. You know, at the end of your academic career, you ask yourself, I mean, am I dignified enough, not as a person, but is what I have to say important enough for a keynote? And I really, for colloquia, I prefer seminar style. It is beautiful that basically we are sitting around a table. If it was oval or round, it would be even better. But I mean, we're sitting around a table. So I think sitting there and being part of you, which is part of the topic I'm going to talk about, is better. So this is why I preferred this format. Also, to be in contiguity with you is going to be another topic. Now let's really get to the topic. This was a long prefatory introduction. I mean, not mine only, accumulated welcomes, but this is also normally more boring than today, so congratulations on that too. You know, I once talked, last year I talked for the Deutsche Rektorenkonferenz, and there was actually 70 minutes of prefatory things before I had to give the keynote, and it was at Kaiserslautern, where I could not resist about starting with soccer 1954, so I mean, okay. So, well, indeed, college football in general, and I didn't know that about you, John. There was a very, very interesting story about your dad and Joe Paterno. College football and hockey, and I'm not only saying that because we are in Toronto, it's not ice hockey in North American English, it's hockey and field hockey. That's the other way around. So college football and hockey have indeed become my favorite sports over the past almost 27 years, which are my American, my Californian 27 years. But I remain faithful, and the word is deliberately chosen, to one soccer team on the globe, and this soccer team is Borussia Dortmund, BVB, as you say in German. Thank you. I know that the Germans are now divided. I mean, half of you like me, and half of you hate me. That are those who root for Bayern, who did not deserve to get qualified yesterday evening against Juve. Absolutely not. It was the ref, of course, as always. I mean, Borussia Dortmund, as you may guess, is the eternal second in the German Bundesliga, except for those years where all of a sudden they get relegated. Last year was almost such a year. Now, what is most remarkable, and I'm not the only spectator and fan of Borussia Dortmund to say that, are indeed the fans, the fan culture in Dortmund Stadium. Dortmund actually has the largest soccer stadium in Europe. I think it is the largest soccer stadium regularly used in the world. I mean, it regularly has, no matter who's playing in Dortmund, it's sold out. It's 81 plus thousand spectators, and those spectators are famous. There is, which is no longer allowed for European Champions League games, a standing-only stand called the Gelbe Wand, the yellow wall, that holds 30,000 people, and they are famous. It is standing only, and it has a certain, maybe no longer sociologically correct, but it has a certain proletarian connotation of feeling. People my age feel it has this kind of connotation. The yellow wall at Dortmund, the Gelbe Wand, has become part of the attraction. I mean, you want to go to the stadium of Borussia Dortmund to also see the yellow wall, and it was clearly the yellow wall and not the team playing there that made Franz Beckenbauer, Bayern München's all-time champion despite the FIFA scandal, say that this stadium is the cathedral of German soccer. I mean, I will actually say that I'm not much with Caillois. I don't think that sports is the secularized equivalent of religion in present-day culture, but it is interesting. It is this fan culture, it is this yellow wall, which made Beckenbauer say that this stadium is the cathedral of German soccer. Now, last Sunday, actually it was exceptionally a Sunday game, something marvelous and strange happened during the second half of a relatively important Bundesliga match, a regular match towards the end of the season in Dortmund Stadium. It was a match against Mainz that Dortmund ended up winning 2-0, what we call in German an Arbeitssieg. Not very remarkable, but Mainz is one of the few teams remaining in the German Bundesliga that can still make a European competition for next year. With much luck, they could even become a competitor of one of the three spots in the European Champions League. But what happened was that during the second half of that game, it was barely 1-0 for Dortmund, the yellow wall remained silent throughout the 45 minutes of the game, whistling down any segment in the crowd that was supporting Dortmund or the other team. So they were not only remaining silent, but silencing the entire stadium. And then about 10 minutes before the end of the game, they started singing a song that in terms of cultural history is imported from Liverpool, another team with a charismatic crowd, "You Never Walk Alone." And it is remarkable to say that probably not even 10% of those people who sing with correct accent, "You Never Walk Alone," know English. That is, they speak in tongues, actually, those crowds. Only after, I mean it seriously, I will actually unfold this motif of speaking in tongues. Only after the game, it became known to the players. The players didn't actually know what was going on. They didn't have the support. I mean, what had happened. They didn't know what was happening. Only after the game it became known to the players and to the other spectators what had happened. During halftime, one of the spectators in the yellow wall had died from a heart attack or from a stroke, and another spectator had to be delivered to a hospital under emergency conditions. And this was the reaction to it, to be silent during a game that mattered to each of those spectators. And there was no conductor. There was nobody who decided, now we are going to sing. 10 minutes before the end of the game, they were singing "You Never Walk Alone." And when the team went to the yellow wall, which they always do after the game, greeting their spectators, they also remained in silence. And I think this was probably, I mean, this is what the captain Hummel said, when the players began to understand that something that was not against them had happened in the stadium. Now, the reaction in the national media was quite respectful. I mean, even Munich newspapers, who normally don't know much about soccer, were positive about that. Except, unfortunately, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, for which I'm writing a lot and which always tries to be very intellectual, there was one commentary saying, if that had been the game against Schalke 04, that's the local rival, this is the equivalent of the Leafs playing the Canadiens in hockey, had they played Schalke 04, that would not have happened. I think in the first place, this is wrong. I think the same thing would have happened in any game. I mean, however important that game would have been. But in a deeper way, the commentator was right. I mean, these crowds are an ambiguous phenomenon. They are well capable of violence and inexcusable violence from an ethical point of view. That can happen. They can be aggressive. Actually, last time I was in Dortmund, I was invited by the Industrie- und Handelskammer, and I wanted a ticket for the game, and my talk was it was a co-organized event by Borussia Dortmund and the Chamber of Commerce of Dortmund. So it was guest of honor, and I got a VIP ticket, and I said to the manager of Borussia Dortmund, could I please have a ticket in a yellow wall? And I said, das ist zu gefährlich für Sie, Herr Professor. I'm not translating that. So I'm seemingly beyond age. I mean, given the violence there. And I said, but I can't give you a bodyguard. And I said, if you give me a bodyguard, then it's really become dangerous. I mean, then they're going to hit upon me with bicycle chains, which they do sometimes. So the point I want to make, they're capable of this marvelous empathy. I mean, I was unfortunately not there, but I think this silence and this "you never walk alone" must have been a chilling, marvelous moment. But they're capable of aggression. I mean, and aggression in a sense that has no excuse. And this ambiguity of the crowd in the stadium is precisely what fascinates me. And this is the reason why my next book on sports, I'm not going to write a serious book on sports. I mean, when I published In Praise of Athletic Beauty, I said, that's it. I mean, I've written that down from my soul, as you would say in German. Ich habe mir das von der Seele geschrieben. But now this phenomenon has intrigued me so much, not just the Dortmund event, that I will write a book on drama in sports. The perspective would be the investment. What do spectators really invest? I mean, when you are in the stadium. So, and it has to do precisely with this ambiguity. Let me say also that, I mean, the investment metaphor that John kindly quoted, that is in the program that I was using now, is no longer what I would have used as a title for my talk had I been asked again a week ago. I mean, this is this problem in the electronic age that you have to write blurbs about your talk, summaries about your talk, before you haven't even started thinking about it. So at that point, I thought investment might be okay. The concept that is in the center of what I will present today and which I try to develop is actually mystical body, which is a theological concept, but let me say once again, and this will not be the last time, I'm saying despite of using at some points theological concepts, I do not agree with this intuition that sports is just a secular replacement of what religion used to be in European societies. I mean, even if it were true, it's just too easy. I mean, this kind of X is secular replacement of Y is really kind of boring. It's the same like with constructivism. Once everything turns into a social construction of S, although this might be true, it is no longer interesting. So I'm using this concept that crowds in a stadium are mystical bodies because I think this concept has a lot of semantic complexity and potential, but it does not mean that I'm buying into this thesis about sport being a secular version of religion. And I think precisely in this ambiguity of what crowds can do, they're capable of this enormous empathy, and at the same time they can turn violent at any given moment. There's always a danger if you are in such a crowd. So in this sense, the manager of Dortmund was right about me being too old to be part of such a crowd. I do think that there's an affinity to the two concepts in the title of this colloquium, and I wanted to congratulate you on that. I think Allure is a terrific, precisely because it is so hard to define and circumscribe, a terrific concept to describe what is going on with sports. It is, and if you look it up in the OED, it's one of those entries in the OED where you see the author doesn't have a clear concept how to describe it. It has to do with beauty, allure and beauty, there is an overlap. It has to do with attraction, a fascination that you cannot really explain. And I think these crowds and the type of behavior that they show is part of the allure in sports. And as John was beautifully developing in his introduction, referring to Joe Paterno, and I do remember what great teams Joe Paterno had created. If I think Joe Paterno, I precisely have this ambiguity. This ambiguity, Stanford has never played Penn State, but watching Penn State on TV and imagining how great it would be if our team played against them and so forth and so forth. And in their own context, I was always rooting for Penn State. And then all of a sudden, something scandalous happens. And you're asking yourself whether this was part of what you liked. I mean, it's not like you have on the one hand the fascinating team and on the other hand the scandal. No, it is part. It is part of what is beautiful. And then, especially as an academic, you think you have to activate your ethical toolkit. Yeah? I mean, so we think it through, we set priorities of action. That is nice, and I think both the German nation and academics worldwide are in this mood today that whenever you have a problem, you say, okay, ethics, and you think it through, and then you know how it goes. The problem is if you think through sports from an ethical point of view, and if you implement that, and you impose that, then what is the appeal, the allure, may dry out. And I think this is the beautiful and very important ambiguity of this topic, the complexity of this topic, that we hope we will work out, and we will not kind of silence and dry out by saying, okay, for each problem in sports we have the ethical solution. I think there is even is not a clear ethical solution for enhancements for what people call ethics. Okay, so you have an impression of what I want to talk about and how I hope my development of my topic, which is about crowds as mystical bodies, has to do directly with what the organizers, especially you, John, had in mind. It was a happy moment when I listened to your introduction, because I thought it is maybe even closer than I imagined. So here's my menu, my outline, the 4 parts I want to speak about. Keep in mind that for me, in a way, this is something like a transition between 2 books. There is In Praise of Athletic Beauty, and I'm not saying I will remind you what I wrote about. I'm not presupposing that everybody has to read my books. I mean, how could I, as a sometimes realistic academic? I will remind you in the first part, or not remind you, I will very briefly present some of the positions that are my starting point. And today is actually the first time that I speak about what could be more or less the outline of that new book. I hope I will find the time to start writing about that this fall. So I begin with 2 premises that go back in a way to In Praise of Athletic Beauty. In the first place, I will be critical about the premise that can be best condensed in a very famous sentence in German: Sport ist die schönste Nebensache der Welt. Sports is the most beautiful marginal phenomenon of our everyday life. I think this is no longer true. Sports is not marginal, and I think we agree on that too, and even the dean seemed to apply that it is no longer marginal. So I also do not think, like some cultural critics, that the fact that sports has gotten more into the foreground is a symptom of a crisis, shows that we are in the final stage of capitalism or God knows what. No, there is something to describe that sport is no longer margin. That's very difficult to describe, and I will start describing. And then I will also briefly come back to this thesis that John had already kindly mentioned, that I believe what really attracts spectators, not only to go to the stadium, but to watch sports, is analogous in its structure to aesthetic experience. I'm not saying that in order to improve the status of sports. I know that, would these spectators in the Yellow Wall, I ended up going to the Yellow Wall for that home game against Eintracht Frankfurt, had they known that I ever had said what their experience is aesthetic experience, they would have hit me. They wouldn't like that, and that's okay. But nevertheless, from our purpose, in order to describe what is going on when you watch sports, it might be useful to recycle, so to speak, certain concepts from the tradition of philosophical aesthetics. And the second out of 4 parts, I start talking really about crowds in a stadium, and that will be about the empty stadium as an ontological place. That is not a good title, but I'm fascinated by empty stadiums. Maybe some of you all of a sudden discovered that you're fascinated by empty stadiums, and I think this status, this specific and ontological, is chosen here intentionally. I hope I will be able to explain that well. This ontological status of the stadium is what shapes a crowd. So I will specifically talk not about any type of watching sports. I will talk about being live, watching sports in a stadium, and probably even the architectural form of the stadium is necessary. So that will be my second part. There is no mystical body, there is no sports crowd without the stadium, and that stadium needs to be empty. Obviously, central is the third part where we'll try to develop, so as far as I can by now, a phenomenology of crowds in a stadium as mystical bodies, and I will unfold a series of perspectives, and this is, of course, given that the book is not ready yet, an open series. In my coda, my fourth part will deal with the question that seems to interest John and some of you, why some teams have such mystical bodies, such mystical crowds. I mean, regardless of where they're playing. I mean, when Dortmund was playing the second league, the stadium was also full, and I bet I have to say that if Schalke was in second league, the stadium would also be full. And if Hoffenheim wins the German championship, the stadium will not be full. And the same is true for Wolfsburg, thank goodness. And I was very happy to hear that the Leafs continue to have a great fan base. I mean, John and I will go to a Leafs game on Saturday evening. I mean, if you only look at the scores, you would say, I mean, what more stupid thing to spend a Saturday afternoon to watch a play of a team late in the season that hasn't made the playoffs in a century. I mean, I'm slightly exaggerating. The second question will be about the future of the crowds. Now, as I'm talking, Borussia Dortmund players in White Hart Lane in London are getting ready for their Europe League away game, quarterfinal against Tottenham Hotspurs. I mean, they won 3-0 at home. That should be a safe evening. But of course, being a fan, I'm nervous about that. And if there's anything in my talk you don't like, please book it on the Dortmund game. I'm nervous about the Dortmund game. But as I'm electronically handicapped despite living in Silicon Valley, if somebody can tell me what the score is when we get into the discussion, and after the discussion, I would be very thankful. Okay. Premise one. Sports, I think, is no longer marginal. It may still be a beautiful phenomenon, but it is no longer marginal. I will just give you a couple of perspectives. This is not only specifically for my talk. It could be interesting for some of the other discussions, especially if you happen to disagree. I think historically we could say that participation in sports and watching sports that used to be an aristocratic privilege. We tend to forget that when we talk about sports in ancient Greece, for example, has been slowly conquered by all social classes. But it is worth reminding people that when modern sports starts, and I think this starts in the English college system in the early 19th century, I mean, the Oxford-Cambridge crew contest is the oldest and continuously happening sports event in history. So, I mean, our sports doesn't start in ancient Greece, it starts in the early 19th century. This was very aristocratic. I mean, who could afford going to Cambridge or Oxford then? It is worth reminding people that the person who had the idea of the modern Olympics was not randomly an aristocrat. Now, today, really, I mean, there is no social group that is excluded from sports. Health playing an important role there. I mean, I will come back to that, but that, our health insurances, I don't know about Canada, but there's hardly a week in my American health insurance that I don't get mail from them or email reminding them that I should practice more sports. I'm asking myself, how do they know that I don't? But anyway, I mean, this is an important phenomenon. Sociologically speaking, sports, of course, is part of leisure. Of leisure as being that dimension of our lives that is radically and clearly and visibly detached from our practical interests. I mean, whether my team wins or not has, thank goodness, or unfortunately, no impact on my banking account or on my professional standing. But leisure for all of us, and this has to do with certain social developments, has gotten much more into the foreground. I mean, leisure time is no longer the exceptional time. This also has to do with average age. I mean, I've decided to go into retirement in June 2018. And, on an average basis, I have lots of years to live. I don't even know whether I want as many years as they predict me. So leisure has become much more central, and with leisure, sports has become more central, and without any distinction between practice sports and watching sports. So there's a historical perspective to that, it's more in the foreground. There's a sociological perspective. And what has changed? That is a third question. I mean, this is just a quantitative dimension. There is no other event experienced, watched by so many living humans simultaneously as the Soccer World Cup final. The estimates for the 2014 final, which was a pretty boring game, except, I have to say, in the presence of the German consul, of that really beautiful goal by a player from the wrong team, Mario Götze. It was not a great game, but the estimates are close to 2 billion humans watched that game simultaneously. So there's no moment. Then every 4 years there's one moment, and I'm not saying the Super Bowl is a close second, but now people in Europe watch the Super Bowl without understanding the rules. I don't know how you can make it through 4 hours of Super Bowl without understanding the rules, but it happens. I would also say, just for you to think about it as an experiment, in a conversation today, as a basis of sociability, sports may be the most important thing. If I imagine a business conversation between two German tycoons, it might be more important whether they root for Dortmund and for Bayern München than whether they elect SPD or CDU. Yeah? I mean, the political parties get more and more blurred, unless you support Trump, you cannot manage to be eccentric. Whereas you have, and I mean it without any joke, a well-circumscribed identity if you root for a soccer team. And I'm sometimes asking myself, there must be Bayern fans here. I could see that when I'm saying I was a Dortmund fan. Are we going to have a good conversation? It has become really important in our everyday interactions who you're rooting for. And if not, you have to bracket it. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just trying to describe something. Now, how has this change come all about? I sometimes believe this has happened actually in the second half of the 20th century. It's kind of coextensive with my lifetime. In the mid-20th century, there was still a deep division between, on the one side, a few sports that could afford professional athletes and had large crowds. And these were mainly team sports, which, by the way, and as a footnote, nobody knows why team sports began to emerge in the 19th century. Team sports were never important before that. And today, when we think sports, we think team sports. I have no answer to that, but it's a fascinating question. So there were some team sports, baseball being one of them, soccer being one of them, tennis being the exception, boxing being an exception, some sports that drew large enough crowds to afford professional athletes. And on the other side were amateur sports. Yeah? And amateur sports, the local soccer team, my hometown Würzburg, would attract 500 to 1,000 people, but that was very limited. There was no TV yet. Now, with TV, but I think especially with the transformation of leisure time and with a general obsession or care about health, things have changed. I will give you one example, and that is cross-country skiing, and I wanted to think about a Canadian example. Cross-country skiing in my childhood was something you would only see during Olympics, and even at Olympics, nobody would watch it. Now, as cross-country skiing is supposed to be healthy, there are many people doing cross-country skiing, like many people are biking, not for pragmatic reasons. And all of a sudden, there's an equipment industry. And that equipment industry enables us, the spectators, to feed, so to speak, a small elite of professional athletes. So there are now professional athletes in every sport. There are very few sports that cannot be recommended for health reasons, biathlon being ambivalent, but biathlon is very, very popular in Germany. Then you have to say, well, I shoot, but this is not for military purposes. And it's well kept secret that all the very successful biathlon athletes in Germany are actually members of the Bundeswehr. Yeah, but anyway, what I'm saying is that today there is no clear-cut distinction between amateur sports and watching sports anymore, between amateur sports and professional sports. There is an enormous sports syndrome that is in the foreground, and for which many of the concepts that we have, for example, the distinction between professional and amateur is no longer adequate. And what is the basis of this profound change? I mean, why is sport so much more in the foreground today? I think it has basically to do with what would be, I think, an adequate description of the time that we spend in our profession, independently of what specifically that profession is. I think the typical professional activity posture, literally, in any profession today, even in professions that formerly were called proletarian. So I'm relatively familiar with Wolfsburg. So what you see when you walk through the production halls of VW people. Those people who 50 years ago would have been at an assembly line doing the same movement every 50 seconds are sitting in front of a screen, and whenever something happens on that screen, they hit a key on their keyboard. Meaning that in most professions in industrialized countries today, you spend your working day glued to a screen, a computer screen, and your leisure time you spend glued to a TV screen. And that means we spend most of our awake lives in a fusion of software and consciousness. Fusion of software and consciousness, with our bodies becoming mainly and barely what you call in French le support. I mean, they're a condition of the possibility of this life in a fusion of software and consciousness, but they have become dysfunctional. And I think this is the background for this enormous expansion of sports. I mean, sports, so to speak, is the activity that keeps alive our somatic life, our bodies, beyond being a precondition for what has become our professional life. In most professions, I know that there are exceptions, but what used to be proletarian professions are mainly professions that happen in front of a computer screen today. Now, my premise number 2 is, I will just kind of play that through very briefly, that the tradition of philosophical aesthetics is very helpful to explain what is going on when you watch sports. Yeah? To give you one example in the German department so that the expenses of the German department are justified, the most classical and most widely acknowledged description of the aesthetic judgment used as an description for aesthetic experience is the one from Kant's third critique, Critique of the Power of Judgment. And there are 3 criteria. He says aesthetic experience is disinterested. Now this disinterestedness, Interesselosigkeit, means it is detached from your everyday interests. And indeed, watching sports is detached from everyday interests. I mean, as I was saying before, how my team, my favorite of all teams, is actually Stanford football, 3rd now in the rankings. You have recognized that has never happened before, the best ranking ever this season. Stanford football, and you know that feeling when Stanford football loses on a Saturday, especially in a home game, which hasn't, well, it happened last season against Oregon, and it was tough because I have a daughter studying in Oregon. And I had to fly to Europe the next day. And when I was landing in Madrid, I still thought that everybody, including the customs officer, would recognize that I was the fan of a losing team. You know that feeling. But thank goodness it is not happening. It is really detached. It also didn't have much of an impact on my professional standing. But I always think Stanford is going bankrupt as a private university when we lose in football. It doesn't happen. Secondly, there are no stable quantitative or qualitative criteria to say that a game was good or not. Yeah? A high-scoring game is not necessarily a better game than a low-scoring game, and there are no concepts that could explain why a game is good or not. But in spite of that, and this is Kant's 3rd criterion, we believe that everybody will agree with our judgment. Yeah? I mean, you all know that feeling. You have seen a game, you thought it was great, you talked to somebody who did not find it was great. And although you know that people have different opinions and that we shouldn't talk about aesthetic judgments, that there's no consensus, we claim, wir erheischen, as Kant is saying, consensus. So this perfectly applies to watching sports. I mean, it is a case, and this is not a joke or something like that, or let alone geistreich, which is the worst you can produce, or a stimulating or anregen. No, it's completely corresponds, watching sports, to Kant's description of aesthetic experience. I will give you another definition that was spontaneously produced by Pablo Morales. Who knows the name Pablo Morales? Most successful butterfly swimmer, I think, I mean, statistically speaking, of all times, Stanford graduate, and then went to Cornell Law School, whom I had in a panel at Stanford once because he was the one swimmer who 8 years after his first gold medals went back to practice. He was a lawyer already, part owner of a law firm in San Jose, did this unbelievable practice, 8 hours in the water per day, and won gold medals again. And I asked Pablo Morales, so why did you do that to yourself? And he said, and I think it is one of the more beautiful sentences I ever heard about sports, I wanted to be lost in focused intensity. I wanted to be lost in focused intensity. Now that was a description about an active athlete who gave up his part ownership in the law firm to practice sports. He wanted to be lost in focused intensity, but I think it perfectly applies to the spectator. Why? First, you have this lust. This lust is another articulation of aesthetic autonomy, of disinterestedness, like Kant. Then second, different from Kant, he brings in intensity. And I think intensity, and I follow Deleuze and Guattari, is a pure quantifier. So your body and your mind does everything it normally does, but it does so on a higher level of intensity. And then there's this beautiful element, focused intensity. When you're watching sports, you wait for an epiphany. Something will show itself, but you cannot count on that. This is an eventness. I think in team sports, it's a beautiful play that may happen or not happen. The economy of that is very different in different games. I mean, mind you that a perfect game in baseball, and there have been around 10 perfect games in the history of baseball, is a game where this does not happen. Because the pitcher is so perfect, so it can be beautiful for this not to happen. But basically, I think this expectation of an epiphany, you are open for something to happen of which you do not know what it will look like, and you will not know whether it will ever happen. It is not so much the goal scored, but it is the beautiful play that would lead to a goal. So this would be another description. I hope at this point I have convinced you that yes, watching sports is a case of aesthetic experience, and once again, I don't think this makes it any better. I think this is helpful for the description of sports. But all I've been saying so far, and this brings me to my second part, and don't fear if you do a Hochrechnung, my talk would last like a football game, 4 hours or something like that. I think I will need another half hour, okay? I will be more focused and concentrated. Now, all of what I've been saying so far would apply for a TV spectator. I mean, what a TV spectator is going through is aesthetic experience and so forth and so forth. What is it that makes a crowd in a stadium, covered or not covered, specific? And I think this has to do, I mean, what is the allure of the crowd, so to speak? And this has to do with the ontology of the empty stadium. I don't know about you, but accumulated, I've spent a lot of money in my life bribing janitors in stadiums to let me into the empty stadium. My greatest moment being sitting for 2 hours alone in La Bombonera. Does anybody know what La Bombonera is? Yeah, very, very competent crowd. So the stadium in Argentina, Boca Juniors, where Maradona was playing. Because when I was sitting in the stadium all alone, I had paid a lot of money for that. All of a sudden, the electricity broke down, and the janitor went home, and I was sitting in the stadium alone, not thinking about whether I could go home to my hotel, which I ended up being able. So why is the empty stadium so fascinating? Not only for me, that's my empirical experience. Well, in the first place, it is, from an economic point of view, a complete paradox. Stadiums now are coming back downtown. So stadiums occupy very expensive real estate, and they demonstratively do not use it all the time. Yeah, normally where the Rogers Center, for example, is, that would have high-rise buildings, but you don't use that. In the best case, the teams don't even use that for practice. The ideal case would be something like El Chamartín, the stadium of Real Madrid. This is today downtown Madrid. It was not downtown when it was first built in the 1950s. You use it every other week, and during the rest of the time, it is empty, which from a real estate point of view is absolutely insane. But it gives this impression, this connotation of being a sacred space. Sacred actually means excluded, set apart. It has a specific fascination. Now, what I find interesting is that this opposition between completely empty and the place of packed action, There's no place where more is happening at the same time than the stadium when it is full. But in the Real Madrid case, who get kicked out early of the European competitions, every other week, and I love that team, which is bad taste, but ethically bad taste, politically bad taste, but it's a team I like. The stadium is empty. Now, this contrast between emptiness and packed action is choreographically repeated when you are in the stadium. You come to the stadium early on, the field is empty. Then the players occupy the field to warm-ups. Then the field is empty again, the players in the locker room. Then they occupy the field. And if you happen to be a hockey fan or a football fan, this is repeated during the games. I mean, football, between two plays, oftentimes the field is empty. Yeah? Same in hockey. So what makes this so fascinating? Why do we have this choreography of the contrast of the empty field and the packed action? My intuition is, and bear with me, I mean, first maybe you feel, first of all, this is a strange idea, but I cannot get rid of this intuition, that this has to do with what Heidegger and others called the most elementary philosophical question, not the most profound philosophical question, not the most original philosophical question, but the most elementary philosophical question. Namely, how come that there is something at all as opposed to nothing? How come that there is something as opposed to nothing? Warum gibt es etwas und nicht nichts? I mean, it is one of those questions, and there are not many of them in philosophy. If you let it sink down, it has almost a visceral impact on you. It is kind of a scary question. It could be logically thinking that there would be nothing as opposed to something. And I believe when you're in a stadium, you become part of this condition. Not that you become an allegory of a philosophical question. That, again, would be a reason for the spectators on the yellow wall to spit me in the face or to hit me with a bicycle chain. No. You are not an allegory. You're not aware of it. But you are part of this very elementary opposition between something, everything happens in the stadium in 2 hours' time, and nothing. So it is a very important condition that the stadium be empty the rest of the time. I mean, I know that not all stadiums are always empty, but ideally the stadium is staged, that is the important condition, as being empty while the game is not going on. So this is the shortest part that I have. I move on to this phenomenology of the crowd, but is the idea clear? That by being in a stadium, you become part of this condition. You don't become an allegory or the expression or the representation of any philosophical wisdom, but you become part of this very elementary condition as being part of something as opposed to nothing. I mean, you could also say this is why, I mean, this is my precondition, being in the stadium and being part of that crowd has such a high degree of intensity. And this is what I refer to as a mystical body, and I will now move on to this phenomenology of the stadium crowd as a mystical body, once again alluding implicitly all the time to your so well-chosen concept of allure. So why am I choosing, or why am I so fascinated in this context by the concept of mystical body? In the first place, it is the oldest self-reference of Christianity. You cannot say of the church because it is way pre-Reform. It comes out of the 3rd century AD. So Augustine, for example, already used that as a self-reference. He didn't invent it. The church is Christ's mystical body. Why I'm so interested in this concept? Because in the first place, it is a concept for a group. It is a human self-reference that explicitly includes the body. Yeah? I mean, Protestantism has a tendency to make us forget that Christianity in its origins is a religion of incarnation. Yeah? Christ's mystical body means that includes your body. You become one with the resurrected body of Christ. It includes the body. In a second place, it excludes agency. It's not like a party where people agree on something and then there is collective agency. if the church is Christ's mystical body, there is no agency. It may, however, and this is a third connotation or denotation, it may be inspired. I mean, being Christ's mystical body, you are inspired by something. There are movements that you may describe as actions. There are changes like speaking in tongues. This is Pentecost, when the few disciples of Christ who are expecting the end of the world become a mystical body and start speaking in tongues. And that means you can speak in a language that you have never learned. That actually happens in stadiums. I mean, it doesn't only happen in the yellow wall. I mean, last year, I took my wife, 2014, I took my wife and my daughter to Maracanã, and it was a very bad game. It was actually Flamengo against Corinthians. I mean, it was a very bad game from the quality. And we had bought very expensive tickets. I wanted the girls to be in the VIP zone because it can really get dangerous and rough in Maracanã. And as so often in Brazil, and I love Brazil, they had cheated us. I mean, they were actually very cheap tickets, and we're standing in the middle of the Flamengo crowd. And I mean, if you translate from Portuguese what they're singing, no woman wants to be there. I mean, there's not a single word that's not obscene. And I said to my wife, okay, let's go home and watch it on TV. And they said, no, let's be there. And they were enjoying it. And all of a sudden, I hear them singing in Portuguese with Rio accent. I mean, none of them knows a word of Portuguese. Yeah? I mean, as you're exaggerating slightly, but you can sing along in a language that you do not know when you're part of a stadium crowd. And you will do things happily, so to speak, that you would normally not do, not always good things. So this is why this concept of a mystical body, including the body, no agency, being inspired to do things that you are normally not able to do, that you have never learned, fascinates me. Second observation is about the structure of the stadium crowd as a mystical body. I mean, for starters, I think it should include the fans of both teams, and it should include the players, and it even includes the refs for once. So everybody who is in the stadium and the janitors and so forth is part of the mystical body. And there's first no distinction between the two teams and their spectators and between teams and spectators. What gives that crowd a form? Because in order to be a mystical body, it needs a form. In the first place, the stadium architecture. And we know well that not all stadium architectures do the same job. There are certain stadiums that turn out to be terrific for that. And the Dortmund Stadium, which was clearly built without any architectural ambition, is good for that. And the Allianz Arena, which is very, very beautiful, is clearly not good for that. I mean, the Herzog de Meuron stadiums, I mean, I think the best architectural firm in the world, do not work in that sense. They don't, I mean, it's not clear. This is a little bit like with acoustics. I mean, you can try to produce good acoustics for a symphony hall, but sometimes it happens and sometimes not quite, and you don't know. Secondly, it is rhythm that gives the crowd a shape. I mean, during the game and with the crowd supporting the teams, there is the rhythm there. But it is interesting that in the boring moment of the games, the so-called La Ola, as people are saying in German, La Ola, the wave kicks in. Yeah, so a wave goes through the stadium and makes a form out of the spectators. So this entire mystical body has a form. But then, and this is a further aspect, you can of course think in divisions, in partitions. One team and their supporters and the other team and their supporters are mystical bodies too, and depending on how the game develops, they can become very aggressive. They can become violent and physically aggressive. This is the reason, for example, why in Istanbul, in games between Fenerbahce and Galatasaray, there is a cushion. There are 20,000 seats not occupied by the spectators in between. And having seen that game once, I think that is actually a good idea. So there is this aggressiveness, and I think I will talk about that later, not much you can do about it. But you can also have another partition. You can separate the spectators from the team. When you separate the spectators from the team, you dissolve the mystical body. I think it is actually, although I'm saying mystical body, the spectators, it's important that this includes the players. I would say the partition where the spectators are separated from the team, that's the VIP lounge. Yeah? In the VIP lounge, you watch the game, you talk about the game very much as if you were a coach, you analyze the game, you talk about it like Guardiola talks about the game, not like Klopp talks about the game. I mean, he's a very good coach, but I cannot stand this intellectuality. And now he pretends he reads Catalan poetry, of which I know a little bit, and it's always the worst taste Catalan poetry. And now I stopped saying bad things about Bayern, really, I promise. But you get my point. I mean, if you separate yourself from the team, then you watch the game analytically. There's nothing sad to be said about it, but it has nothing to do with this mystical body idea. So, but how does then the spectator see a game if he's not separated from the team? I mean, the spectator who is separated, the spectator in the VIP zone has different perspectives. Yeah, even if you are a mild Dortmund or Bayern fan, you can try to see it from the other team's perspective. This is actually what a professional has to do. A coach has to be able to do that. I mean, so what will the other team have thought? I mean, very important in American football. But if you are in the mystical body and are part of the team, and this will be the greatest challenge for my book, and I hope some of you will help me along with that, I think you rather experience, in the sense of erleben, lived experience, the game in an absolute way. I mean, what is happening in the game is not seen from a perspective. What is happening in a game, if you are part of the mystical body, appears to you epiphanically. And epiphanically means that what shows itself is a substance, is a body. It is not something to be interpreted. You are in a spatial relation to it, and your own body is implied. I think, I mean, this is my case, and some of you are familiar with that. In Stanford football home games, I'm absolutely exhausted about the 3.5 hours of a college. I mean, this game we lost against Oregon that cost us the national championship, or playing for the national championship. I was exhausted, but I'm also exhausted if you're losing. I mean, if you are part of the mystical body, being there has a strong impact on your body. I think epiphany is the right repertoire of concepts to describe what is going on, but epiphany is not enough. Finally, I think being part of a mystical body produces what I like to call Stimmungen. And the translation of Stimmung is atmosphere, is mood. One can define Stimmung in the following way, or I propose to define them in the following way. You could say what triggers a Stimmung, a mood, is always the lightest physical, and the underlying physical touch of your environment on your body. Yeah? For example, the weather. I mean, depending on the weather, you're in one mood or the other mood. It can be individually different, but also music gets you into a certain mood. This is why there's a song, In the Mood. Yeah? It gets you in the mood. Nobody has described that in a more compact and beautiful way than Toni Morrison in jazz. She says, it is like being touched from inside. And what I want to emphasize here is the paradox. You cannot be touched from inside. But it is something that touches you from outside and then produces a certain mood. And I think this happened to my wife and my daughter in the torcida, as you say in Brazilian, in the crowd of the Flamengo players. I mean, these people hopping around and singing and being very enthusiastic and having these fogos artificiais, I mean, this fireworks, had an impact on them. And all of a sudden, they were in a Flamengo mood. And at that point, were actually pronouncing, as they were singing along, words that were completely obscene. And that for political and feminist reasons, they would never have pronounced. Would they know Portuguese? Maybe yes, they would have sung them in Portuguese, being part of the crowd. You get my point? I mean, the Stimmung that is produced by standing with other players, so the physical contact is important, by standing with other spectators, makes you part of this mystical body. And once you're part of the mystical body, you are subject to the inspirations. You can do as beautiful things as all of a sudden singing You Never Walk Alone out of empathy for somebody who died there, whom you never know. But in a way, this is what Marx was dreaming of. This would be that type of empathy and solidarity that the communist parties of the world or the socialist parties never produced and that they should have produced. But at the same time, if somebody starts rushing and being aggressive with the other side of the spectators, you're also part of that. And few are the people who are able to resist that. So I think there is a profound ambiguity This also, I think, explains why, if your team loses and you're not watching it from a distance, you are embarrassed, and even if you are the next day 10,000 miles away, you still feel that people see that you are part of a losing team. You are really, in almost a literary way, I will not say in a literary way, you are part of a body, you're part of a mystical body, and the mystical body makes it different from a somatic body. Okay, I come to my coda. First of all, how come that some teams have such a mystical crowd independently of winning or losing, and other teams have not? To give some examples, I mean, the Leafs are more and more turning into such an example. I mean, they haven't won anything. I mean, given the fact that this is the Canadian national sport, it continues to be Canadians who produce championships, I mean, NHL championships for American teams, but the Canadian teams cannot win. I mean, the situation in Montreal is not much different, but the fan base continues to be strong. And maybe it is not enough to say, oh, this is just because it's the Canadian national sport. Famous examples in soccer, I've already mentioned one. I mean, Dortmund had the same number of spectators playing in the second league. This is true for many teams in the English Premiership. Baseball seems to be the sport where this is the truest. The Chicago Cubs, for example, never win anything, but they are one of the most popular teams. And I would actually say the fact that the Boston Red Sox finally, after the 19 teens, won World Series was not necessarily good for their image. Yeah? The most eminent example, and I wonder whether anybody knows that, is the Hanjin Tigers. The Hanjin Tigers are playing in the Japanese Baseball League. The Hanjin Tigers have not even won one of those tiny baseball leagues in decades. Now, if you want tickets for the Hanjin Tigers, and like every baseball game, they play 2.5 times per week in their own stadium, you have to get them 3 years ahead of time. Yeah? I mean, the Hanjin Tigers are an absolute phenomenon. Do I have an explanation for that? I'd rather emphasize that I don't have an explanation, but I will give you what I have as an explanation. In the first place, you cannot willfully produce it. If it is not there, it's very difficult to produce that. I do not know a single case where somebody by planning has done that. But maybe you can destroy it. I think it is important, for example, for the stadium to be in the same place. Yeah, the Dortmund Stadium, for random reasons, is standing in the same place where the stadium was standing in 1956-57, when Dortmund for the first time won a German national championship. Actually, it is more interesting. It is not standing in the same place, but it is literally contiguous. The old Kampfbahn Rote Erde, what a very Ruhrgebiet proletarian, Kampfbahn Rote Erde is contiguous, you can still see it, to the new large stadium. They have not moved away. And the same is by and large true for Schalke. Yeah? Die Glückauf-Kampfbahn that created the glory of Schalke in the 1930s is visible from the new Schalke stadium. So they're basically in the same neighborhood and visible. Whereas the problem with Bayern München, that has the most beautiful stadium in Germany, the Allianz Arena is absolutely beautiful, is that Bayern München in 30 years of glory has changed their stadium twice and have crossed Munich from the southeast to the northwest. Yeah, the Stadion an der Grünwalder Straße, which was horrible but was relatively charismatic. The Olympiastadion as a track and field stadium was never good for soccer. And the Allianz Arena, moving so much in a short time is very difficult. I mean, I do not know, to say that again, a better stadium than the Allianz Arena, but it doesn't do the trick. So I think space, that we normally don't think much about when you do humanities, is very, very important there. You cannot produce that by the stadium architecture. I think, secondly, there is a certain composition of the crowd that is important. Now, can that really be class-bound? I mean, yes, I'm saying the Dortmund crowd has this proletarian connotation. But there are not so many proletarians left in Dortmund. That is a memory from the 1950s when it was still a coal and steel town. I mean, today is a town of Hartz IV people, jobless people who are living on a minimal state income, and it is a town with many employees. But maybe what matters is a certain physical contiguity to know that people who were living in your neighborhood, to know that your father, I mean, as John was saying, was going to that same stadium and your son is going to that same stadium. But I do think that there's a spatial and maybe even biological continuity that is important in that sense, but I will admit that I don't have an answer. Yeah? I mean, we can observe that certain teams have it, and however hard their management is trying to get it, when they don't get it, it will not happen. And the Munich stadium is full, but it is not. It never is a hot fan base in that sense. And this is, for once, not saying anything against that team. And finally, the future of crowds. I mean, logically, in a way, I'm almost tempted to say, when I was your age, some of you, in the 1970s, when for the first time TV contracts were made with major team sports, the prognostics was that stadiums will end up being empty. Yeah? If you can watch it live on TV, and of course you watch it better on TV, you have commentary, you have multiple perspectives, you have close-ups. You see much more of a game on TV than you see in a stadium. But this has not happened. I mean, stadiums, the average occupancy of stadiums worldwide, and I could give you the stats, is much higher than, each last year is the highest year. And tickets, think of the English Premiership, cannot be idiotically expensive enough for people not to go. It is quite astonishing. I'm asking myself how the yellow wall in Dortmund, given that these are mainly Hartz IV people, can fill up. But I regret that, but people go there. Now, what is the reason for that? I have given you one speculation. It has to do with how we spend our everyday, even our leisure time, in this fusion of software and consciousness. But maybe if you allow for one last, and that's the end, a philosophical speculation, maybe there is another supplementary reason. If we say that since modernity, whenever we have modernity start, we experience our everyday as a field of contingency, in the German sense of contingency, randomness. For each phenomenon you are confronted with, you have multiple perspectives, multiple ways of reacting, multiple ways of interpreting it. But it is a field of contingency. That means it is surrounded by certain things that are not contingent. On the one side, necessary things, and on the other side, impossible things. Things that you can imagine, but that you know will never happen. And I think we find ourselves today, in the last quarter century, in a meltdown of these zones of the necessary and the impossible. Let me give you two examples. What used to be the emblem of fate, something you could not change even if you did not like it, was sex. You were born into sex, into one sex, whether you like that or not. Now today we have this horizon of hope of transsexual surgery. And it is absolutely fantastic. And it is, I think, one of the things of our period to be proud of, that this is possible. But it takes away one more thing that used to be necessary, not able to be discussed, not able to be transformed. On the other side, the emblem of the impossible was eternal life for humans. Now, whether this will ever happen, we do not know, but you do know, all of you, that eternal life has become a research perspective for medical schools. Whether this might become possible. So what I'm saying is that we are living under conditions, at least in what we call Western global culture, we're living under conditions where, with the melting down of what used to be necessary and what used to be impossible, we live no longer in a field of contingents and of randomness. We live in a universe of contingency. We live in a universe of contingency, which I think explains this desire, this politically incorrect desire, to have situations where you can hold on to something, to be part of a body where you do not have to choose what you do without knowing it, what everybody else does. And I think this is not only sports crowds. We do know empirically that if the Pope shows up somewhere and reads a mass, there will be 1 million people. And we do know that less than half of those people know what the Pope is actually doing. I mean, they vaguely know what the Pope is, but what a Mass is and what it means to say, be the Spirit with you and I bless you, they do not know, but they like to be part of this mystical body. This is another mystical body. The most obvious phenomenon being public viewing. We know once again empirically that only half of the, I think, 1 million plus people who were standing around the Brandenburg Gate watching the Soccer World Cup final 2014 really cared about the game. But they were part of a mystical body. And I think in this sense, the crowds in the stadium today are symptomatic of something larger. I'm almost tempted to say that's not going on. I mean, our everyday goes exactly in the opposite direction. Maybe there's an overload of choice, of freedom. It is so difficult in the electronic age to only organize your weekend, let alone your annual vacation, because you have so many possibilities. You like to be part of a crowd. I'm not a delegate of Donald Trump and saying that would be good for people, but I think there is this ambiguity. And what is the future of the crowd then? I think there's a beautiful formula by my colleague and much admired friend Peter Sloterdijk, who said crowds will be in the future, and then he says either drunk spectators who cheer doped athletes, and they are together, or that will be the alternative. It will be almost in a sense of Nietzsche's tragedy book, the euphoric communion of spectators who are excited and elated by the elite performance of athletes. Something absolutely wonderful. Something I sometimes feel when I think that our football team at Stanford has a 100% graduation rate, and they are number 3 in the country, and as I'm on the committee that controls the academic performance, they are really good. So this is something unbelievable, unlikely, that they can play so well. But I would like to end on this ambiguity. I think crowds can be both. Crowds are part and maybe the emblem of what the title of this colloquium is referring to under Allure, what makes sports fascinating, what makes sports appealing, what makes sports also enigmatic. We have nothing but ethics to try and control that, but there's this other secondary ambiguity. I think if we think it through and control it too much by ethics, we're going to, in the literal sense, dry out, dampen, and kill what makes the allure of sports. And I thank you so much for your attention. I'm curious how Borussia Dortmund is playing.
Thank you very much, Seth, for that. That was wide-ranging. I have so many things running through my head, and I'm sure a lot of people do out here too. I just want to ask you for a sec. Would you like to field your own questions, or would you like a question fielder?
Question fielder is nicer, because if not, one is always unfair.
I'll play shortstop for you.
Yeah. Shortstop is nice.
I'll sit back here then, so I can keep an eye on things. But who would like to start off with the questions? Yes, please, go ahead,
So I sort of have a question about the scope of your account. So most of the examples that you talked about were team sports and crowds in stadiums. And what I'm into mainly is endurance sport. And you sometimes get crowds in that context as well. To a lot of people, watching a marathon is like watching paint dry. For me, it's really exciting. So I'm wondering to what extent your account applies in that context, and does it need to be modified? Does it stay the same? What gets added? What gets taken away?
Yeah, I mean, I try, by the way, to give short and compact answers, which I'm not very good at, which you may guess after having listened to me. In the first place, yes, of course. I mean, pretty much everything I've been saying needs modification because I've been talking about sports at large, and I could have said I talk in this sports athletic books and Principle of Athletic Beauty a little bit about it. It is one of those phenomena where the fact that there is one all-comprehensive concept existing leads us into the temptation to think, oh, it's all the same. I mean, sports is an enormous field of differentiation. So I think as far as crowds are concerned, there are clear differences according what sport it is. Yeah? I would not necessarily say it is team sports and the rest. I think the crowd in a boxing match, especially in the great age of boxing, which I think was the 1920s, crowd in tennis sometimes has a behavior that is similar to team sports. I mean, one would have to see what is the line of differentiation. Whereas there are sports, track and field is typical for that. I think gymnastics is typical for that. I mean, endurance sports, swimming and so forth, where the crowd is typically other athletes or friends of those. And this is nothing negative. I mean, there are certain limits of how many people come, and they all have a different relationship. I mean, it cannot be this mystical body relationship without knowing the players. I could have said it is almost a condition of the mystical body with Borussia Dortmund that you do not know the players. Once you know them, it's a different relationship. So one would have to make a distinction there. And now comes a but. I mean, this but does not do away or eliminate your question. With the exception that, as you all know, endurance sports, that nobody would have predicted to have any crowd, you know, before the Olympics. I mean, the marathon, the Olympic, which was for some reason also the concluding event of the Olympics, a very famous one in 1936 Olympics with the Japanese, but in reality Korean Kitai-son winning against the favorite who was Argentinian. But normally nobody would watch it, and all of a sudden there are millions of people watching it. And I do think that this increase, which statistically is much more dramatic in endurance sports than in team sports. I mean, team sports has even increased. You know, people thought it was maxed out in the 70s, so it has even increased. But the people attending marathons worldwide, that must be, I mean, I don't know. I mean, this must be thousands. I mean, times thousands more people. I think that has to do with the general desire for mystical bodies that is relatively independent of sports. I'm not saying that they cannot watch great sport, but you get my point. I mean, how much do you see in a marathon? I mean, what is dramatic is over in a fraction of a second. Yeah? Or at the Tour de France. I mean, the people watching the Tour de France is also, I mean, arithmetically increased by the thousands. Yeah? I mean, so this desire to be part of a body, and will not always say mystical, part of a collective body, has become important there because, I mean, being a specialist, you would probably say most people do not even exactly know what is going on, who are the famous athletes when you watch a marathon. Yeah? Like, I mean, for example, I mean, something like the Tour de France is endlessly complicated to understand what is really going on there, why somebody's attacking, why not attacking. You always see a fraction of a second, but you want to be there. So yes, differentiation, yes. Maybe as a footnote, but the answer would have been a very different one 10 years ago. I mean, you know, the interesting phenomenon is that all of a sudden endurance sports too draw these amazing crowds. Sorry.
Thank you, Professor Gumbrecht, for that talk. I was going to ask about the sort of political intentions of controlling that mystical body, because at the beginning you spoke about the semi-proletarianized sense of the yellow wall at Dortmund, and I think that I might have a wider definition of proletarian than you do, possibly with reserve army of the
No,
proletariat.
you can say Hartz IV is proletarian.
Yeah, but the thing that it made me think of immediately was the fact that with the founding of the Premier League in the early 90s, there was an explicit banning of the standing space in England. And so that is one of the things that English fans notice most heavily when they visit Germany is the existence, along with the ticket prices being lower, of the standing space. And it reminds you of that, you know, more from text, but the idea of that, you know, Times columnists call it slum people and slum stadiums, and with the Hillsborough disaster in Liverpool, with the Liverpool team and Nottingham Forest, that they that sort of the state or the various hierarchies are very aware of this mystical body and desire at times to break it up or to sort of, because like, I guess, you know, I also think the secular church is simplistic, but that's another place albeit sort of with pew prices, like in older churches, where you can go and no one asks you, you know, as you said, what is your social status?
No, I'm certainly aware of the problem. I would say if you see it from a purely economic point of view, like those American investors who own Manchester United who don't even know what soccer is but want to make money, I mean, they would be well advised to not break it down because the yellow wall is one of the reasons why the Stadium Dortmund is always full, and the yellow wall is why Dortmund is popular, and the yellow wall is a key reason. I mean, there's also a certain playing style, but it's a key reason why you can sell this team at a high price at the media, which I actually, to be very capitalistic, I think the Germans have no idea. I mean, the German Soccer Federation has not maxed out by any means the money they can get, and they should get, actually. So I think in the first place, and that makes the question more complicated, for economic reasons, it is becoming increasingly clear now that the elimination of those crowds, those groups from the stadium, and the transformation of the entire crowd in a potential VIP crowd who don't care what the ticket costs and will spend half of the time eating and drinking anyway and chatting is not a good thing for the event. I mean, that you actually, I mean, there have been efforts made. I mean, Hoffenheim is trying that, for example, to kind of artificially create a Hartz IV crowd, call it a Hartz IV crowd, and introduce them in the stadium again. So this is my first reaction, what you're saying, that I think it would not be in the quote-unquote best capitalist interest to break those crowds down. But let's face it, I mean, there's also a conception of sports that, you know, we as academics would normally subscribe to, which is very similar to the official conception of sports in the socialist states that are against these crowds. Yeah? I mean, let me say in a provocative way, there may be a thought that if you want to have that crowd, you cannot completely ban the danger of violence from the stadium. And this is not because they are proletarians or whatever, but this is, I mean, there's a famous case in the European Championship in France where there was a super aggressive, in Lens, German crowd after a disappointing game, and people thought, oh, these were proletarians from the Ruhrgebiet. It turns actually out that among the couple of hundred people who rolled down and killed one police guard because he was standing in front of them, they were mainly Cologne yuppies. They were actually wealthy people. You get my point? I mean, this violence, that is my hypothesis, has nothing to do, I mean, I've played with this proletarian connotation, with the social background. It has to do with the phenomenology of how you are in the stadium. And I wouldn't exclude that if I would still be admitted to the yellow wall, I would be part of the danger, not because I'm so strong, but so you get my point. So either you want to have that and then you don't completely eliminate violence, or you want, you know, a germ and violence-free stadium, and then you might go to the Protestant church better, the Lutheran church. I'm not saying Catholic as an ex-Catholic. You get my point in the connotation.
So I checked for you, Sepp, and the game doesn't start until 35 minutes from now.
Thank you.
And from listening to you, correct me if I'm wrong, I get the sense that you're more of a Dortmund fan than a Bayern fan. And I say this because my question is why? Mm-hmm. And I ask this from the perspective of someone who, and you will be scandalized when you enter our home, you will see that there are Bayern paraphernalia and Dortmund paraphernalia belonging to a son who loves them both and is a child. And of course,
well, you have to invite me then. I have to have
the love of soccer. The love of soccer begins in childhood, and you talked about the Dortmund stadium and perhaps the mystical body being transferred from father to son and so on. But you mentioned that you grew up in Würzburg, so I wonder where that love of Dortmund came from. And I wonder if it isn't also possible that the mystical body begets itself because people from all over Germany are drawn to what they know this Gerbewand is and what they know this stadium will represent. And I know that when John brought our son to a Dortmund Hertha Berlin game, they sat in the Dortmund Kurve, even though we were in Berlin. So why is that? Why? And when does it begin? In what part of childhood? I mean, I see for our child that, and I see everything now through his very fanatical eyes. It began with the World Cup and with the players. And it doesn't matter to him if Götze plays for Dortmund or for Bayern, or where Hummels plays, or where any of them play. But it becomes much more important later. And I just wonder where you see this mystical body beginning in terms of age and childhood and fantasy.
Thank you for this super competent question, which implies the temptation of speak for 2 more hours. I give very, very succinct answers. And the first answer is actually not an answer, but it's an opportunity to say something. As I was saying that you cannot artificially, quote unquote artificially, produce, why not, a mystical body if there's no local tradition. It's very, very difficult. There's a similar thing, and not only in soccer, I think, for playing styles. I mean, once the Beckenbauer times finished, and this was 1974, the second World Cup that Germany won, Bayern has played this very successful, very rational, and if you like that, game. And coaches cannot transform it. Guardiola is not playing tiki-taka. Yeah? I mean, he's playing some very kind of, very, sometimes elegant if you like it, very rational, very success-oriented team. The same is true for Dortmund. I mean, Tuchel is not playing Klopp, and Klopp is not playing Tuchel. It was really, there are certain styles that are being continued, that are local, and that are very, very difficult to change. I mean, I think you find similar things in, I would say it's USC, Stanford. There are certain styles that transcend coaches, which is interesting. I mean, of course, certain coaches make a mark, others not. But this is a second condition. And then, I mean, here's the temptation, but I think the story is typical. I mean, the word I've been using, you need some contiguity. You need a charismatic moment in your life, maybe the evening where you had sex for the first time, you watched the game before with somebody, with that person, and that is the one game and the one team you will never forget. In my case, it is that my mother is actually from Dortmund. But there's an even more incisive reason. My grandfather had the restaurant that was, and I pronounce it with a Dortmund accent, that Verkehrslokal of the BVB in the 1950s. And German soccer only became fully professional in 61. Until 61 it was semi-professional, but the players had certain perks. And one of the perks was that they were allowed by the German Soccer Federation to take their families to a paid dinner after the 2 practices they had per week. Yeah, and they, of course, in this proletarian environment in Dortmund, each player had 20 family people coming, and that was my grandfather's restaurant. And when I was on vacation, Dortmund is not a good vacation place, but yes, I was on vacation regularly in Dortmund, Osterferien. I could stay up and see the players from close. Yeah, and I can still completely memorize. You wake me up and can memorize the lineup of the 1956 Dortmund team. I'm saying that who is interested in my grandfather's restaurant? Nobody. But I think it is such moments. Yeah, and I think with your son, of course, I mean, there is a contiguity from his parents being, close to German culture. There is this game, but it was the German national team that consists of Bayern and some Dortmund players. Yeah. And there will be hopefully a decisive moment in his life, maybe I can handle that, where he will become a Dortmund fan. I actually have tickets for the home game against Hertha in Dortmund in April.
So I have a bunch of people who would like to ask questions, and we're already a bit over time, so I'll just ask for maybe short questions for Bruce, and maybe short answers to yes. We have plenty of time throughout the next couple of days to sort of ask Bruce and Stefan and Marcus, with the caveat as department chair that you might, if we run out of time, ask the question during the coffee break. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Bruce, yeah.
This is a great project, and I look forward to the next phase of it. In addition to the differentiation between different crowds for different events, I think you need a historical periodization as well, sure. Along the lines of what you've done before, because I can see real stages in both the subject activity of mythical bodies, and also the efforts by the stadium owners and the authorities to shape that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the European, the Soviet bloc experience with the effort to reduce the crowd or to control the crowd because it was a source of opposition. I would say in North America too, I mean, one of the things that you said reminded me that the now Rogers Center was initiated by politicians who wanted to control, it's hard to believe in Canada, but control the unruly Canadian football crowd. And so, you know, seriously, you know, Bill Davis and Paul Godfrey hated the way that people were drinking too much beer and pissing in their seats at Argo games, at Exhibition Stadium, and they vowed to create a place that would be much more available to control. And then now, since that time, and I see this as a big North American European difference, the commercial control of the crowd. I mean, in my childhood, crowds were much more autonomous in how they, and now it's all, the crowds don't have a second to think for themselves. And that has changed behavior in remarkable ways too, about which I'd love your observations.
Yeah, just, I mean, two brief commentaries. This is so true what you're saying that I'm just, you know, thinking of examples. There are, of course, different crowd cultures. I give you just one example because it is so complex. I don't know whether anybody knows that, but for some strange reason that has to do with the Meiji period, without any doubt, Japanese crowd behavior at baseball is copied from college crowd behavior in American football. So the baseball game in Japan is completely different because you have these on ladders, these conductors in front of each block, and they have songs for each person who comes to bat. So it's a completely different atmosphere, which partly explains why the Hanjin Tigers sell out 3 years ahead of time. So, I mean, yes, there are culturally very different moments. And of course, what they copy was college football probably in the early 20th century. So there are historical periodizations, you know. The German First League soccer that I went with my father to in the 50s, Würzburg had no First League team, was very different from what is going on today. So there are regional and historical differentiations. It is the kind of book that I may end up writing if my mind maybe doesn't go strong anymore. I mean, I hope it still goes strong. You know, I mean, this kind of broad book where you can really kind of, like a color book, I mean, it would be fascinating to do that and to document that. And the level of differentiation is absolutely endless. Now, your second point is a concern that I absolutely share. I mean, I absolutely hate how major league sports events, and this is what I like about college, it is not quite as bad, are being orchestrated. I mean, first the Thrombotor in the middle, you know? I mean, if you have the hockey tickets that we will have will make it impossible Saturday evening to only fix on the ice. I mean, just physically. I mean, the reproduced images are so big that you cannot. I mean, you would have special glasses to just look on the ice, and that is a metonymy of what is happening in the stadium. There are constantly games. There is constantly. I mean, I don't mind the commercials, commercials so much, but that you're constantly obliged to do something. You know, in a football, between plays, you need time to discuss and to think what the next play is going to be. That's the fascination of American football, and it is absolutely horrible how these spaces are being filled up. If you're sitting at home watching TV, you can piss while you have the commercial break if it's too long during the Super Bowl. But in the stadium, you have to sit there. It is absolutely, absolutely horrible. I don't know what one can do about it. My ambiguous hope is that the generation of the now 20-year-old are less bothered by it than I am. And another hope is the popularity of college basketball and college football, which is actually a complete idiosyncratic phenomenon, only exists in America. I mean, that non-professional sports draw those crowds. And I feel, you know, if I look Stanford, USC, UCLA, the teams we are playing, there are certain local traditions, crowd traditions, that are long-standing and in the literal sense of the word, very conservative. And I like that a lot, but I do not have a recipe how one could cultivate that. And even that gets permeated.
Well, you need fan ownership and control, and that's a utopian dream, but we should keep it alive.
Yeah.
Maybe one last quick question. Yeah.
Sorry.
Actually, one short remark. As far as I know, all-time second in the Bundesliga is still Werder Bremen, which I support.
All-time second in what sense?
In the Bundesliga, statistically, points and so on. You mentioned that Dortmund is.
I like Bremen,
Well,
but
but I was actually going to ask.
delighted to hear
I
that.
was actually going to ask about the mystical body, which is maybe a far-reaching question, but you said, as far as I got it, that there is no distinction between the players and the spectators as for the mystical body. But then I thought, well, this is about aesthetic experience. What about the aesthetic experience of the players? So they perceive as well, but they do not only perceive the spectators. They perceive themselves among each other. And is that not more of a technical body and not a mystical?
Yeah, no,
body?
it's very, very interesting. I mean, I'm really at the beginning, you know, this is why I'm so grateful for your questions and answers and distinctions and corrections. In the first place, it does seem to matter to the players that they have their mystical body. I mean, I think especially in American football, I see that, you know, I mean, Stanford Stadium, unfortunately, I mean, I'm a fan of one team, that's Dortmund, has this fantastic mystical body. The Stanford football Spectators always sold out, but Silicon Valley, it can be sold out, the stadium, 55,000, only 25 are there. And they're not a very good crowd. It's all those people, when it's decided, they leave for home. Yeah? I mean, sometimes I feel I'm the only spectator who stays. And yet, it matters to the players. Yeah? I mean, the other Pac-12 players call actually Stanford Stadium the library. Yeah? This is about the most horrible thing you can say, but it sometimes feels like that. And I can see the players, you know, between plays doing this. I mean, it matters to them that they, I mean, not strategically, it's also not the famous thing that then the other team cannot communicate. No, I think it matters to the players. Yeah? Now, what you are speaking, this is very, very difficult. I've actually written a text about it. It's horrible to say you remind me, I can send or give you that text. Oh, it's also already published, but anyway. And that was the question, is what brings the players of a team together? Friendship. No, it is above all not friendship. Very few players stay friends. It is a different type of relationship. What I find statistically interesting is that there is, I mean, it's statistically proven, a disproportionately high amount of players are brothers. So siblings are sisters, yeah? There is lots of sibling relationship, and I find that interesting because I do not exactly know what to make of that, but it is a very primordial relationship that is not necessarily positive, like with a friend. Yeah? So, but the fact that there was Fritz Walter and Ottmar Walter, for example, yeah, that was, they didn't like each other at all, but they would get primordially along. So the relationship between the team is a different one, and I think as you have a different spectator relationship, once you exclude the team, you get tendentially the VIP relationship. I think you also get a different relationship for the team when you exclude the spectators. So that's the question, how do they get along in the locker room? How do they get along when they are traveling? And how do they get along on the field? And phenomenologically speaking, I'm asking myself whether for the question on the field you can exclude the spectators. I mean, I think the more holistic approach, a more complex approach would include them. But I haven't completely made up my mind. It is at this point of my reflection about it, it's a question of where to draw the lines, and what I've been trying out today, these partitions are an attempt to how to play that. I mean, I would always start with saying that the primary thing is that everybody in the stadium, janitors and refs included, is part of that mystical body. And then you start with partitions, and I'm not quite sure of where to draw them yet.
Thank you. So before sort of formally thanking Seb, I just want to make some technical announcements that we're running about 15 minutes ahead of time, or behind, so which is ahead, that would be great. Yeah, behind. So we will start the next session right at 4 o'clock. There is coffee and some treats next door. But before we go over, I would like to take this moment to thank Seb very much for the talk, and also to say that some of the things you brought up, especially at the end, the sports as a way of understanding perhaps our overload of possibility today, which might produce something like the mystical body, will give us a lot of things to keep talking about in the next couple of days. So thank you very much.
And I thank you, and may say I got a card from the consul here to leave early, but confesses that he's also a Dortmund fan.